Hello everyone. In this video, the first one on Abraham Merritt's Through the Dragon Glass, we're going to discuss some background information pertaining to the author of this work and the story itself so that you can better understand the historical context in which this story is set, the kinds of aesthetic movements or artistic movements and historical issues that this story grapples with or refers back to, either directly or by way of allusion. Abraham Merritt himself, unlike most of the other authors that we study in this course, was primarily a journalist rather than an author of fiction. Generally, as an author, his stories focused on stock or archetypal characters. They were typically heroes that were gallant adventurers, men's men, and villains that were suitably racialized, let's say, or semi-adversarial to American and British values. So there are these tropes of xenophobia and the like from his particular time. This story was published in 1917. It's one of his earliest works of short fiction when he was 33. It was published in, as you can see from the image on screen, the Argosy All-Story Weekly as a fantasy tale. Some of the background information that pertains to this text. First, I would like you to pause this video and watch the short video that appears in the description about the Boxer Rebellion. It's a short 2-minute clip about a particular historical moment that is referred to in this story and is actually the source of much of Herndon, the main character's wealth. Pause the video and watch that now. So, in the video that you saw, you had a brief clip from the History Channel discussing the history of the Boxer Rebellion, its impetus, and its consequences. In brief, as was described in that video, the Boxer Rebellion was a conflict between various different kinds of colonial powers like the United States, France, and Britain, and China, wherein they were attempting to open up markets. Now, there are a number of different complex issues at play here, as this desire to expel foreigners and a kind of xenophobic tendencies that developed inside China, both for legitimate reasons because they didn't wish to be exploited by these colonizing powers, and also for arguably illegitimate reasons because of religious hatred and also racialized issues. The nation itself couldn't necessarily rebel, but different secret societies and sects arose over time, including the one that was mentioned in the video clip and in this story, the Boxers. Now, Boxers was an appellation that was given to them by the colonizing powers, when in fact they weren't Boxers per se. They were a kind of religious quasi-cult or group that practiced different kinds of spiritual techniques, martial arts, and spirit possession channeling, believing that they could gain functionally supernatural powers like immunity to firearms and the like by channeling spirits of divinities and ancestors. This group began a violent suppression of Christian missionaries and converted Chinese nationals in the country. They began slaughtering them, executing missionaries, attacking mission fields, and killing off those Chinese Christians, Chinese citizens who had converted to Christianity. Now, in part to stop this grievous assault on human rights, and in part because of the interests of the colonial powers, the economic interests, Britain, France, the United States, Russia, Japan, and other nations banded together to send in parties to suppress the Boxers, to prevent them from attacking the missionaries, killing Chinese Christians, and generally rebelling. But the real issue, covered over by that humanitarian one, although it was legitimate, was one of economic interest. And that is what we see in Herndon. Herndon, we learn, became most wealthy because he looted the Forbidden City during the suppression of the Boxers. So he was part of this colonizing force that went in to suppress the Boxers, and he looted specifically this hidden city, as did many of the troops that were sent in, and earned his fortune through the spoils of this conquest. As a result of this conflict, we have a kind of reciprocal escalation of violence, wherein both parties begin to inflict atrocities upon each other, and this is the context for Herndon's activities. Keep that in mind as we think about what the narrator has to say about Herndon and the kind of man that Herndon is as we go through the rest of this story. The other subject that I'd like to address is not directly related to this story, in that it's not something that is referenced by the story, or it's not something that is inspired by the story, but understanding the issues that underlie it and relate to it will help us to better grapple with some of the subjects that the story deals with, specifically pertaining to beauty. And that is the aesthetic movement. The aesthetic movement was a particular kind of artistic philosophy or a movement in art that advanced certain values. Remember, we've talked about things like surrealism briefly. We've talked about the literary and artistic philosophy of different authors in the context of this course, what they believed the purpose of art was, what they tried to represent in their art, the kinds of styles that they adopted, and more. What we have here is a satire, a representation of an aesthetic, so a member of this aesthetic movement, sitting down to have a midday meal. So, even though you don't know anything about the aesthetic movement, we don't know necessarily what the principles of it are, I haven't discussed that yet, we do have this satirical representation of them. We do have an image that is mocking the aesthetic movement. So what I'd like you to do is to take a look at this image and try to parse it out and analyze it. Take 10 minutes to jot down everything that you can about this image, the observations that you make about the characters involved, the description of the image itself that appeared in this satire magazine, Punch. What are they saying about this member of the aesthetic movement? What critique are they making of the aesthetic movement? Or how are they making that critique? What do you know about this man here, Jellyby Postlethwaite, and the movement that he is representing? So you have a waiter here who is serving Jellyby Postlethwaite, the member of the aesthetic movement, and it's a mockery of the aesthetic movement. So from this image, what can you say the aesthetic movement is all about? What kind of presumptions can you make? And what can you gather from the way in which these characters are represented? Their body language, their position, their look, and more. Also think about this blurb of description here at the bottom of the page. Okay. Like I said, take about 10 minutes to think about that, and then when you come back, I'll analyze this image and then discuss the aesthetics movement briefly. What we have here in relation to the aesthetic movement as described in the Encyclopedia Britannica article on aestheticism is this. Jellyby Postlethwaite feasts his senses on the beauty of a lily rather than the food and drink from the restaurant he sits in. He, and by implication aestheticism, is shown as utterly at odds with the world around him. Du Maurier, who is the artist of this piece, further ridicules aestheticism by associating it with effeminacy. Note the contrast between Jellyby's hands and posture with those of the conventionally masculine waiter. Though the ludicrously named Jellyby Postlethwaite was a favorite and recurring caricature in Punch, a poet who sometimes resembles Oscar Wilde and sometimes the artist Whistler. So look at the respective positions and appearances of these two characters. You have the rather robust and masculine, authoritative waiter who is leaning over Jellyby Postlethwaite. And Jellyby Postlethwaite has sort of curled his hands up next to his chin. His legs are crossed. So these are all stereotypical signs associated with effeminacy, which in this context, given the time period, would have been something that they would use to mock this man. So the aesthetics movement is associated with a kind of detachment from real life, a kind of fixation on art, and effeminacy, fundamentally. They're not masculine. You only need to look at the interaction between these two characters in the dialogue to pick up on that. At the luncheon hour, Jellyby Postlethwaite enters a pastry cook's and calls for a glass of water, into which he puts a freshly cut lily and focuses himself in contemplation thereof. The waiter, shall I bring you anything else, sir? Jellyby Postlethwaite, thanks, no. I have all I require and shall soon have done. So he's surviving, he's living off just the artistic enjoyment of this object. He's sort of pretentious and ridiculous, foppish. The artistic philosophy and movement known as the aesthetics movement was fundamentally oriented around the very thing that Jellyby Postlethwaite here is contemplating, the beauty of a flower. Now, might not be flowers specifically, but the aesthetics movement is primarily concerned with beauty. Aesthetics functionally means that. It's a kind of philosophy of beauty, or when you say, my aesthetic tastes are these, or we're talking about aesthetics. You're talking about matters of preference, taste, and beauty. What makes something beautiful? That would be a question of aesthetics. Now, the rallying cry for aestheticism or the aesthetics movement was a phrase, art for art's sake. For the aesthetics, art didn't exist to convey some kind of didactic message. Its purpose was not to inform or to teach, to instruct. It wasn't to convey any kind of social lesson. In fact, these things oftentimes would detract from its ultimate primary purpose, and that being the conveying of beauty. Art exists for art's own sake. Nothing else needs to justify it. It is self-justifying. It's self-referential in that art conveys beauty. So the entire edifice of the aesthetic movement is one designed to allow for the creation of beauty. And all the various different techniques that they adopted and approaches that they employed were all oriented around that creation of beauty. Their adherents developed a kind of ornate writing style in the case of authors. They were focused on elaborateness and intricacy. Structure was important to them because of that concern with intricacy. The more intricate the structure, the more effective and more beautiful the work of art could become. The works themselves were meant to be impenetrable. They weren't meant to be consumed. For instance, some people would argue that low art, right, like a common novel, would be designed to be sold, art for financial sake. The members of the aesthetic movement said no. In fact, we want to make our works as difficult to digest as possible. We don't want our literature to be accessible. We don't want it to be mass produced. We want it to appeal only to a very small coterie of like-minded individuals who can appreciate the complexities of our work. In that sense, it is kind of pretentious, saying we only want to appeal to a very small subset of the population that has this evolved, refined aesthetic sense. So they would layer their texts with dense allusions and metaphors to things that the common man would never be able to understand. In so doing, they would make it difficult for that common man to read the story and to understand it. It would make it would encourage that individual to set it aside because it was just too dense and too rich. Now, Through the Dragon Glass is not a work from the aesthetics movement. Abraham Merritt was not an author in this particular stream. So keep this in mind. We're not talking about aestheticism when we're looking at Through the Dragon Glass. But this idea of art existing purely for the sake of beauty, art for art's sake, is one that you should keep in mind, because fundamentally, this story, Through the Dragon Glass, is a story about beauty. It's a story about art, the weird tale, in a kind of metatextual sense, a commentary on the nature of beauty in relation to the weird. Now, Merritt doesn't intend it as such. He's not consciously engaging with the genre of the weird. However, it gives us insight, because Merritt has this recognition, of the relationship between the artist's quest for fantasy, beauty, and escape from reality, which is what aestheticism was all about, right? Taking us out of reality, just like Jellyby Postus Waiter, who doesn't live in the same world that the waiter does. It's a connection between that and horror, that sense of odd listening that Lovecraft describes. So this story is going to be a window into the relationship between art for art's sake and beauty and the weird. In that respect, the last thing I'd like to cover in this video is the nature of the story as a weird tale. I would argue that this story involves the third type of classical weird setting. We've already talked about two. In The Mark of the Beast, we had a weird setting wherein characters were thrust into an alien and unknown world inside of our own, right? This mystical, exotic province of India, right? At least to Kipling's audience. In the Orla, we had the penetration of the weird into a familiar setting that rendered that familiar setting alien and horrifying. It transformed it, it metamorphosized it. Now we have the third class of setting, where we enter into a wholly weird world, a world that doesn't operate according to our laws. In this alien fantasy world beyond the dragon glass, a portal into another world, you have dragons and gods and devils and the like. So all these things could exist in this fantasy world, just as ring wraiths and dragons can exist in the fantasy world of the Lord of the Rings. What the author does here, though, is quite clever. In order to maintain the nature of this story and the feelings associated with the weird, he sets up two distinct worlds. One wherein we have a supernatural weird tale, and one wherein we have a fantasy weird tale. When bizarre events occur inside the real world, let's say the world on our side of the dragon glass, inside Through the Dragon Glass, we have supernaturalism. We have things that the characters treat as abnormal and bizarre. The very idea of encountering a portal that leads us into another world is exactly that. So that's supernatural, or that is a supernatural weird tale. On the other side of the dragon glass, when the characters enter into that alien world with norms and laws laws of physics and the like that don't conform to ours, suddenly we can't assume that anything that is sane and rational in our world actually applies there. Why shouldn't there be dragons and multi-hued creatures and immortal beings and the seven stars in the sky, or the seven moons of Rak? These things are entirely possible, plausible, and in fact, well, natural and normal inside that bizarre fantasy world. It's the juxtaposition between the real world that we have, the world so similar to ours, but for the one distortion of magic with the dragon glass itself, the portal into another world, and the fictional fantasy world beyond the dragon glass that helps to create the sense of the weird. The realism in the story is the one side of the dragon glass, wherein everything operates as it should. The weird is everything that happens on the other side, and it bleeds into the real world or the normal world that seems so much like ours. As we go on, we're going to apply some of these ideas and use them as a basis for our discussion of the story and what Abraham Merritt is trying to say through it, and also what we can extract from it regarding the genre of the weird.